back after 10 hours of deliberations. What are you telling him?
This is the worst. I mean, a lot of times your client is incarcerated or in custody, so you mercifully aren't with them stressing out, waiting for the jury to come back. And with each passing hour, you try to check your emails, you try to return some phone calls, but it's hopeless. You just can't stop thinking about the trial and the verdict and what the jury is doing in there, especially if they're not sending out a lot of notes. It really is hard to divine what they're thinking about if they're not telling the judge with any notes for clarification. So none of us will ever know what they're saying in there. None of us will ever find out. But that doesn't mean we don't try to guess whether we're sitting with our client or alone in a library somewhere just sweating it out.
After that verdict is read very shortly, there will be a lot of shoulda, coulda, woulda, I would have done it this way. Ahead of the verdict right now, what stands out to you as a weakness or a missed opportunity on either side's presentation?
The prosecution really followed Prosecution 101. They called in a lot of experts on each issue. In a way, it was, what defense attorneys sometimes call in our jaded way prosecutorial overkill. But I don't blame them at all because they have the burden. They have the burden to prove each and every element beyond a reasonable doubt. So if I'm the prosecution, I'll bring in as many experts as I can to cover each and every element as completely as I can. And they did that. They brought in the scientists. They brought in the use of force experts. They brought in the eyewitnesses. This was a very good job the prosecution did, bringing in eyewitnesses. And you might ask, well, why do you need eyewitnesses to a video that we can all see? Well, the prosecution very cleverly brought them in to make this much more emotional than it already was by those witnesses telling the jury about their reaction, what they thought. And you couldn't have gotten any better witnesses for the prosecution. You had a firefighter, you had an MMA fighter who could opine almost like an expert himself. On the defense side, I mean, they stuck to the battle plan. They really attacked the two main pillars, the main themes we knew they would attack. Number one, causation. And that was that Derek Chauvin's knee in the back of the neck may have been mean. It may have been not very nice, not very polite, but it was not the cause of George Floyd's death. But causation being so tricky, that really delved into a lot of science and a lot of complicated things that jurors and lawyers alike were dealing probably for the first time. And then, of course, they attacked the use of force, and they brought their own expert, the defense did, and they argued that, look, not only was this force not a felony, it was something that was accepted and taught. So it could not be an aggravated assault. It could not be something that was imminently dangerous because it was acceptable. And the defense would and did argue that all of the force, right up until they pulled George Floyd out and put him on the ground in the prone position, up until that moment, the use of force was warranted. And then they had to fight whether or not the knee in the neck was the causative factor, the substantial causative factor in George Floyd's death. And we're going to find out in a minute if they got it right.
Danny, we'll invite you to stay with us. We may be in for a long afternoon, so thank you for being with us. Melissa Murray is an NBC News contributor and also a former law clerk to Judge Sonia Sotomayor. It's great to have you here. I want to talk about how this case has come to symbolize police use of force and racial tensions between communities and police. Unlike so many other cases, this wasn't about a split-second decision, a flash. It was a cell phone, or maybe it was a gun. This was 9.5 minutes. So should we be looking at this case in isolation as different from many others?
Well, there do seem to be some idiosyncratic elements to this case that are very different from the ordinary course of things. As you say, there wasn't necessarily this split-second moment where a police officer may have misapprehended what a civilian was doing. For example, the Mohammed Noor case, which happened also in Minnesota shortly before the George Floyd case happened. Again, a lot of these cases require split-second judgments. Policing is inherently dangerous, and all of those things may factor into a trial like this. But what seemed to be the case here, and the prosecution really hammered it home in their closing statement, was an officer who didn't seem to regard this individual who'd been detained as a human. He was dismissive of him, callous to him, picking out the rocks from the tire as he had his knee on his back. And, honestly, a missed opportunity, I think, for the defense was that Derek Chauvin really never showed any emotion during this trial. I mean, he was masked for most of it, but we never saw anything that looked like regret from him. And I think the jurors probably saw him just sort of staring with a kind of flat affect throughout much of this trial. And maybe, again, that would have had some kind of reflection or inflection point for them as well. But I think there are some missed opportunities here, but I also think this was a very sort of singular case.
And we'll be able to put it in greater perspective in the coming minutes as we await that jury to return to the Minneapolis courtroom and deliver their verdict. In the meantime, let's go to NBC's Gabe Gutierrez. He's been following this trial since the beginning last month. We talked to you about a half hour ago, and we're seeing a lot more people there in anticipation. Describe the scene and what's about to happen there, Gabe.
Yeah, Lester, this crowd is growing by the second. You can see several people, several dozen people, perhaps several hundred now, yelling Black Lives Matter. And this is similar to the crowd that we've been seeing over the last couple of days. Peaceful protesters that were supporting George Floyd's family. But Lester, I want to set the scene a little bit here. If you look, this is the Hennepin County Government Center. This is the courthouse where this has all been happening. In the distance, you can see up there a military presence. Several members of the National Guard here, very tight security. This entire area has been fenced off since before this trial started. But Lester, we've been speaking with many of these protesters, and they said that, again, this has been a very difficult trial for them to watch, a very emotional trial for them to watch, a trial that has given them a lot of anxiety as they awaited this verdict. And just within the past few minutes of the announcement of the verdict being read, we saw this crowd gather here. There's a lot of media here as well, really from around the world, but also some folks that we did talk with from around the Midwest that came here to view this trial and to see what the verdict would be. So again, Lester, as we await the verdict, and it could come, any minute now, this crowd has gathered here. It's now numbering several hundred. They have signs with Black Lives Matter. You have somebody on a loudspeaker right now saying no justice, no peace. Again, this case really has come to be seen as putting the American policing system on trial, although inside that courthouse, the prosecution and the defense both say that this is about the actions of one police officer, the actions of Derek Chauvin. But these folks here see this as much more than that. They see this as one of the most important trials in recent memory. And again, they're gathering right here as we await this verdict. Lester?
Gabe, as we've been talking about, there are 3 charges: second-degree manslaughter, third-degry murder, second-degree unintentional murder. Do you get a sense from activists, from the crowds, what they would consider, I hate to use the term win, but that's all that comes to mind at this particular moment, or how the family views it?
Here you have lost communication with you, but I can describe the scene right here. You see people holding their fists in the air. Again, this is a scene we've seen play out over and over again throughout this, ever since George Floyd was killed last May. A very emotional time for the folks here. And I'm going to send it back to you, Lester.
All right, Gabe, we'll get those communications issues worked out with you. Thank you. I want to go to Kristen Welker right now at the White House. The White House has made some planning for a reaction to this verdict, and the president himself has, in recent hours, commented on this case. Kristen, what can you tell us from there?
Well, Lester, let me set the scene for you at the White House right now. President Biden was about to start talking about his American jobs plan when it was announced that there is, in fact, a verdict. So those remarks have now been delayed as the president and this administration monitors these developments. As one White House official told me, they are watching and waiting along with the rest of the world. As you point out, President Biden and his top officials have been preparing for him to make some type of statement, remarks, reaction once there is a verdict. But earlier today, during an event, he was speaking and was asked about the trial, and he said that he prays that the jury reaches the right verdict. Now, those comments came under an immense amount of scrutiny. We asked the press secretary about it repeatedly. Was it appropriate for President Biden to weigh in on the verdict in that way before, in fact, the jury had come out and spoken? She denied that he was trying to put his finger on the scale. Instead, she noted that he had spoken to the family of George Floyd, that this was clearly an emotional time for them, for the rest of the country, and he was clearly echoing that. Now, taking a step back, Lester, we know that the administration has been in close contact with state and local officials. They are urging the public to remain calm once there is a verdict, that if there are protests, for them to be peaceful protests. And of course, that echoes what we are hearing from the family as well. We'll be watching closely to see what President Biden has to say when and if, in fact, he does speak publicly after there is a verdict. We know that the issue of criminal justice, of racial equality, has been one that he has spoken about quite extensively. And right now, the administration, from a legislative perspective, has been pushing for Congress to move forward with a bill titled the George Floyd bill, which would make it easier to prosecute police misconduct. So that is the scene here behind the scenes within the Biden administration as they watch and wait for a verdict. Lester?
Kristen, thank you. We are past 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central, within the window now when we would expect to hear from the jury their verdict in the case of former officer Chauvin. While we await that verdict, let me bring in Eugene Robinson. He's a Washington Post columnist and NBC News political analyst. Eugene, always good to see you. This is a moment of deep breath for everyone. We're all emotionally tied to the story because we were witnesses to it, to the extent that we saw that videotape of George Floyd dying under the knee of a police officer. As we await this verdict on 3 charges, what, in your view, should we be keeping in mind? What's our deep breath? What should it look like right now?
Well, you know, we should try to remember that this verdict will be about the specific officer and what he specifically did that day to George Floyd. That this is a micro situation with macro implications, with implications for the whole country, and for so many of us, for so many African American men, Lester, it's personal. It feels intensely personal. Could that have been me under Derek Chauvin's knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds? Could it have been one of my sons who found himself in that situation? And so this case, it's not just that it has taken on an outsized importance. It really does symbolize so much about this country's 400-year struggle with race and this country's frankly refusal to sort of acknowledge and grapple with the concept and reality of systemic racism, especially in policing. And so we've been so many of these incidents and so many of these deaths, and frankly, we've seen so many verdicts go in favor of police officers who were acquitted. And there was a sense in this case, because it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and because the video went around the world, there was a sense that this is where we have to draw a line, that this has to be seen as unacceptable by everyone, regardless of race, whoever you are. You have to see this as having been unacceptable. So now the question is that the way the jury saw it? And will the jury, in essence, ratify what many of us all think we saw in that video, or will they take a different view? And what does that say to African Americans and to us personally about how we are seen in this country and how we are treated and how we are regarded? George Floyd was not treated like a citizen by Derek Chauvin. It wasn't treated like a member of the public that Derek Chauvin was sworn to protect. I think we could all agree on that. Yet that's what we're supposed to be, and that's what we have a right to be. And so just an awful lot seems to hang on what these poor 12 people decide. My sympathies are with the jury because this has got to be difficult for them. And it's certainly got the rest of us on tenterhooks just waiting to hear what they decided.
Yeah, they are sequestered, but they are certainly citizens of this country and this world, and certainly have to have some inkling if not a lot of inkling about the climate in this country. Eugene Robinson, thank you. Let me go back to NBC's Gabe Gutierrez. I understand our audio connection is back. And so, Gabe, let me ask you about what will happen in the courtroom. The verdict will be read. What would you expect to see next?
Well, Lester, it's such a highly anticipated moment. The jury will be brought into the courtroom. The verdict will be read. They'll go through the three charges, as you've been discussing, second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, and a verdict will be read for each of those charges. Then, shortly after the jury is let go, we anticipate the Attorney General, Keith Ellison. He will be speaking publicly, and then sometime after that, we also expect to hear from the Floyd family. But what happens after that, of course, local authorities have been urging folks here to stay calm, as I was mentioning earlier, and we can see even a growing crowd here that has been gathering here right outside the courthouse. But again, just a few moments away potentially about hearing this verdict, something that has been so long awaited here in Minneapolis. But yes, we expect the verdict to be read. There's also the consideration of whether there will be aggravating factors in this case. In other words, bumping up any potential sentence. We don't expect sentencing to happen right away, but as has been discussed, Lester, each of these charges carries up to a certain amount based on if there's several aggravating factors. In this case, we're told that the judge will decide on those aggravating factors, but with a second-degree murder, the maximum penalty being 40 years in prison, with a third-degree murder maximum being 25, and then the maximum for second-degree manslaughter being 10 years. But the recommended sentencing for each of those charges, based on first-time offenders like Derek Chauvin would be, that is much shorter, 12 and a half years or so for the first two charges, second and third-degree murder, and 4 years for second-degree manslaughter. So there will still be those outstanding questions on exactly, what a potential sentence would be if there is a conviction. But many of these protesters, and demonstrators right now, they just want to hear what exactly this verdict will be, really, as not just the city of Minneapolis watches, Lester, but really the entire country.
Gabe Gutierrez, thank you. As we look from above, the aerial view of the park there across from the courthouse, not a lot of people, but certainly a growing crowd that we've been watching there. They, like the rest of us now, anticipating this announcement within the next several minutes is based on the window we've been given, the verdict to be announced by the jury in the Derek Chauvin case. Let me go to NBC correspondent Megan Fitzgerald. She's also in Minneapolis covering the reaction of the city. You've been talking to some of the demonstrators, Megan. What are you hearing? What do they anticipate? What do they expect?
Yeah, Lester, we were out here yesterday when shortly after those closing arguments, hundreds of people filled the streets here in Minneapolis calling for justice for George Floyd. And we talked to people asking them, what does that look like for you? And it's a couple of things here. They say that they want to see a guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin, but they also want to see changes systemically to the way that police in our country. This is a deeply personal moment, a deeply personal trial for people all across the country, and we see that, and we have been seeing that with the diverse crowds of people that have come out and protest across the nation. We talked yesterday to people who flew in from different parts of the country, saying it was important for them to be here to show support to George Floyd's family. In fact, I had an opportunity to speak with them yesterday, asking them how they felt as we awaited the verdict, and they said that they're anxious. They're ready for this entire process to be over, but that they're very hopeful that Derek Chauvin will be found guilty. And they realize the magnitude, just the gravity of this case, telling me that this is bigger than their brother. They feel as though their brother was publicly executed, they say, a modern-day lynching, as they call it. And they say if there is not justice for George Floyd, if there's not a conviction here, that they don't feel hopeful that anybody will get justice. But they were pleased that the protests yesterday here in Minneapolis remained peaceful, and they are calling for peaceful protests moving forward, but certainly hopeful that they will get the verdict that they are hoping for, Lester.
Megan Fitzgerald down there in Minneapolis watching the crowds. Thank you. NBC News legal analyst Paul Butler is a former federal prosecutor and Georgetown School of Law professor. Paul, just give me your thoughts as we await this verdict.
So It's a relatively short deliberation process. It's hard to read anything into that. Typically, if it's a short deliberation, the conventional wisdom is that favors the defense. But in a case with this quality of evidence by the prosecution, I think all bets are off. We know that in the only other murder conviction of a police officer in Minnesota, that jury also deliberated the almost exact same amount of time looking at the exact same charges, second degree and third degree murder and second degree manslaughter.
All right, Paul, thank you very much. Let me bring in Mary Moriarty, a former chief public defender for Hennepin County, Minnesota. We thank you for being with us. Can you walk us through the process of how it will play out, the mechanics of the verdict, since you're obviously familiar with those courtrooms?
I can. The jury will be brought in when the judge is ready. And when they walk in, there will be one person who will have the jury verdict in their hand, and that's the person who will be the foreperson. And as a lawyer, you're always looking at that because you wonder who the foreperson will be. The judge will ask them if they have a verdict. The foreperson will say, we do. The judge's clerk will go get the verdict and hand it back to the judge. It can be the clerk, but it's probably going to be the judge who will actually read the verdict. And then the defense has the right to have the jury what is called polled. In other words, the judge will ask each individual juror if this is their true and correct verdict. He'll go down the line with numbers. They will all probably say yes. And then at that point, the judge has to make a decision if he's found guilty, if he's going to take Chauvin into custody because he is out on bail. On a presumptive prison case, he would be taken into custody. The state has asked for a sentence greater than the Minnesota sentencing guidelines, and so there will be Chauvin actually waived his right to have the jury make that decision about whether there are aggravating factors. He is allowing the judge to make that decision, but the judge has already said in a previous order that he will allow the lawyers to write memos on that issue to try to convince him what the appropriate sentence will be. So we won't see a sentencing today. That would probably be in a couple of weeks or however much time the judge gives the lawyers to write their memos.
All right, thank you for that perspective, Mary. Eddie Glaude is an NBC News contributor and joins us now. Eddie, we're watching the crowd build, and as I've been saying from the beginning of this, emotions have been high in this from the first time we saw that tape, so today should be no different now as we await the verdict. But what should people know? And I asked this question to Eugene a moment ago. We're in a deep breath moment now, waiting for this moment. What should we be thinking about and focusing on?
Well, unlike what the prosecutors told the jury, this trial bears the burden of the nation's central contradiction, Lester. And so there is a sense in which America is on trial here. And, you know, whether they come back with guilty verdicts for all three counts, or if they just simply convict on second-degree manslaughter. The latter, I think, will generate discomfort, a kind of, disappointment in some ways. So I think the nation needs to be prepared for a kind of intensification of the reckoning that we've been experiencing around race, because policing in this country takes us to the heart of the contradiction. And so the trial won't resolve it, but it certainly has placed it in clear view for the nation. So we will see. My stomach is in knots at this moment, because I know that we stand on the precipice here.
All right, Eddie, thank you very much. Let's go back to Gabe Gutierrez right now on the ground outside the courthouse with the crowds. Gabe?
Hey there, Lester. So we were just speaking with a demonstrator. Hi, man. How are you? We were just speaking a short time ago, and you were talking to me about how tough it has been to watch this trial. What is the significance of what's happened here in Minneapolis over the last few weeks right in this courthouse?
Well, it shows that after a year of being apart from each other that we come together for the stuff that matters. You know, this has affected every single one of us that not only lives here, but across our nation, across our world. And we came here because we need justice, and we deserve justice, and we need something to change.
You were also telling me it's been very tough to watch. Have you been able to watch this trial?
No, I haven't been able to watch any of it. It's been traumatizing, reliving it over and over and over and over again. I haven't even watched the video of him being murdered. It's too much. It's too much to normalize all of it.
What do you think this what do you think is the significance of this trial moving forward, not just for Minneapolis, but for policing in America, for social justice in America?
It means that they're finally listening to us. How many times do we have to say it? How many times do we have to cry and scream and burn down buildings? Enough's enough. Like, you have to listen to us.
There's been a lot of people that have, you know, there's been local officials have been very careful to tell people to protest peacefully. What do you make of, you know, how Minneapolis looks like now? With it's so boarded up, there's razor wire all around this city. Do you live here in Minneapolis? Are you a resident here? How tough has it been to see this community be like this for the last several weeks?
The audacity to bring people in here when you couldn't protect the Capitol. What have we been doing here? We've been asking for peace. We've been asking for justice. We've been asking for what we deserve. Like, are you kidding me? It feels like a slap in the face.
How often have you been out here? I know there was a crowd here demonstrating outside during jury deliberations. Were you out here yesterday? You know, what do you expect to happen next after this verdict?
When George Floyd was murdered, I was out every day, and we were out. That's the thing that they didn't see on the news, is that we were out donating, and we were fundraising, and we were out in the streets trying to help build things back together. I haven't been able to be here since the trial started because emotionally, it's, like I said, it's too much. But I know there's, and I'm not threatening when I say this, but I know there's going to be a problem if this verdict doesn't go the right way. And I'm praying that this time we get to see the justice that we're asking for.
The Floyd family has called for peace. You know, what do you say to people who might be worried about exactly what might happen if this verdict doesn't go the right way?
We want peace too. That's what we wanted to begin with. If Chauvin would have been peaceful with the way he was policing, this wouldn't have happened. And I'm not advocating for burning everything down and, you know, whatever the rhetoric is, but protesting is the language of the oppressed, right? So it's not on me to what's going to happen next. It's on them. It's on them.
You know, ma'am, I've been to many of these protests over the last year or so, ever since George Floyd died. And speaking with folks like yourself, something that I've heard over and over again, this is the first time that potentially you might feel heard. Is that kind of what this experience has signified? Do you feel heard after what's happened here today, or not quite yet? Do you feel that you haven't been heard?
I will feel heard, and I think we will feel heard when they convict him. Otherwise, it's just radio silence again.
What do you think this means again? You know, do you think policing in America? Do you think this trial will change anything? Do you think that there needs to be more police reform? Do you think that any meaningful change will happen in your view from this verdict?
I hope so. If we're able to look at the history of what policing is in America, it was never founded to support people that look like me. So there needs to be change. There needs to be an evolution, right? So we need to stop doing the same thing and expecting different results.
Thank you, man, for talking to us. We really appreciate you taking the time. So, Lester, her comments are something we've heard over and over again here. Just she said she was traumatized listening to this trial, had a very tough time listening to it. You see a frustration among many of the folks here wondering what the verdict will be. But, you know, I wanted to share her story with you because it is something we've heard over and over again, not just over the past couple of days, but really since the death of George Floyd last May, Lester.
And Gabe, thank you for sharing that interview. It was a good interview, and we appreciate it. I want to, first of all, let you know we are at 3:54 Central Time right now, near the end of the half hour in which we were told that we would be hearing the verdict. But as you know, things move on their own time, so we're not going anywhere. We'll continue to wait for that jury to return to the courtroom and the announcement of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. As we watch the crowd build in Minneapolis, let's take you all the way to the White House now. Kristen Welker is there. Kristen, they are watching all this very carefully there.
They are watching it very carefully, Lester, and I just spoke with a White House official who tells me that as we speak, preparations are underway for President Biden to speak once there is a verdict. That will likely take place sometime this evening. What specifically will the president say? Well, of course, they have to wait until there is a verdict, but this official tells me that the president will call for peace regardless of the verdict. Now, we know that in the past weeks, the president president, senior administration officials have been in touch with state and local officials in Minnesota, the governor there. We anticipate that the attorney general will play an active role in making sure that any protests are peaceful. There had even been some discussion of being ready to mobilize the National Guard should that be necessary. So they have been bracing for this moment for quite some time, Lester. And again, it does come on the heels of President Biden speaking to George Floyd's family, an emotional conversation by his own description of what took place. And then those really striking comments that he made in the Oval Office earlier today, saying that he is praying that the jury reaches the right verdict. He said it's overwhelming. Now, those comments have come under a fair amount of scrutiny today, and I can tell you that in these past minutes we've been speaking to allies inside and outside of the White House who acknowledged that they weren't the most helpful comments at this moment, in part because it's opened him up to some criticism, including from some Republicans who have said that they are concerned that that type of rhetoric could inflame a nation that is already on edge as they await this verdict. So Press Secretary Jen Psaki answered a number of questions about this earlier today during the briefing, including for myself. I asked her if it is ever appropriate for a president to weigh in on a case of such magnitude before there is a verdict. And she said the bottom line is he was not trying to weigh in on the verdict itself. Instead, he was echoing the emotions that go along with this trial. So the White House is watching and waiting to see what will happen along with the rest of the world. And Lester, I can tell you that top officials are huddled in their offices as they try to prepare to respond. Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker. So we'll monitor that front as well. I want to go to NBC's Tremaine Lee. He's been closely following the trial. He's in the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a traditionally black neighborhood there. Tremaine, great to have you on. You're in a place obviously steeped in African-American history. I want to run this past you. And I'm sure you've been part of these conversations. There is a sense among activists, among communities of color, that this one should be an easy call. And I'm wondering if you see a risk in that assumption, thinking that this one will be different.
Lester, you know what, folks in this community, especially as you mentioned, there's such a deep history in this Greenwood community. They dealt with the 1921 race massacre. Then in 2016, Terrence Crutcher was shot and killed by a police officer. It was on video. There is currently a bill working its way through the state legislature that would make it illegal to film police. So this idea of a wariness to get their hopes up, even in the face of what so many people believe is evidence that is clear and just crystal clear, right? So to your point there, they don't want to get their hopes up because black folks in this country haven't really experienced true justice. And so in this case, one way or the other, as I was speaking to a lawyer activist in Ferguson on my way to Tulsa, and he said, no matter what, America is not on trial. American racism is not on trial. Police aren't even on trial. This is the trial of Derek Chauvin. And so after the verdict is read, whether it's a guilty verdict or a non-guilty verdict, if policing doesn't change in this country, especially the way black bodies and black communities are policed, what difference will it make? So that wariness, that anxiety, that kind of tightening of the gut that so many people are feeling all across this country, a place like Greenwood, these residents know it more than most, Lester.
Yeah, Tremaine, thank you for joining us, and please stand by as we continue to wait for the verdict to be announced from Minneapolis. As we do that, we want to turn to criminal defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, we talked earlier about, I called it the speed of the verdict. I think you countered that, they sometimes go this quickly. But does it tend to favor one side or the other?
Take all the conventional wisdom and courthouse gossip you may have heard about quick verdicts and throw it right out the window, Lester, because when it's a high-profile case, all the rules get scrapped. Nothing is what it normally seems. And in a case like this where you already have complicated jury instructions for really complicated crimes. I mean, these are two forms of murder, which everybody grows up thinking murder is an intentional act. But in this case, it is a conceitedly unintentional killing for both second and third degree murder. So expect the jury to struggle a little with that. And that raises the question of, did they do one of two things? Did they walk into that jury room and say, I don't think the state made any of its case? Or did they walk into the jury room and say, I don't think the defense had it at any point here? And, we may never know exactly how the discussions went down unless the jurors are willing to talk afterwards. But this short verdict does certainly suggest that the jurors didn't go through all of that detail, at least that the prosecution put up in that very effective grid, showing all of the elements, all of the information. That doesn't mean that they discounted it. They may have just felt the prosecution already made its case, or on the other side, that the defense made a stronger case, or at least that they raised reasonable doubt. The defense never had to prove innocence. They just had to raise reasonable doubt by undercutting any of the framework of the prosecution's elements of the crimes.
They gave them a kind of an a la carte menu, the idea that maybe he died from carbon monoxide poisoning from the car, that maybe his heart was enlarged, that the drugs affected things. Was that more or less than you would expect in a case like this in terms of things that the jury might be able to hang a reasonable doubt belief on?
That's right. I mean, those elements, so you had three major causative elements that the defense argued. Number one, that fentanyl levels were well above what studies show is a fatal dosage. I think he had, his were at 11, and studies show that 3 is enough to kill with fentanyl. Methamphetamines were not at a fatal dosage, but combined with other things like his poor health, his obstructed arteries, and even his COVID diagnosis, and this is what the defense argued, could have caused the death. But in a sense, the burden here was flipped for the defense because in Minnesota, as long as the defendant set into motion the events that caused the death, that is enough for causation. In a way, it kind of inverts the burden and puts the burden on the defense to show that no matter how mean or nasty this knee was on the back of George Floyd's neck, it was not a substantial causative factor. The true substantial causative factor was that George Floyd's poor health combined with drug intake was the cause of his death. In a sense, the defense did have a burden here. They undertook a burden to prove their alternate theory, which was causation, and we're going to find out whether or not they met that burden. And of course, I use burden in air quotes because the burden always rests with the prosecution. It never shifts, and the defendant is supposedly cloaked in the presumption of innocence.
Yeah, the defense also talking about what a reasonable officer would do in this situation. That was a lot of part of their closing. Let me go, actually, let's just check where we are. We're a little after 5 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Central Time. On the left of your screen, you're watching the crowd gathering near the courthouse. We were expecting to hear the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. We still are. We were expecting to hear it in the last half hour, but we remain with you as the wheels of justice turn toward the verdict in this case. The jury formally deliberating a little over 10 hours before reaching their decision here early afternoon Minneapolis time, and we got the word that between 3:30 and 4 Central Time we would hear a verdict. But no doubt we are drawing close, and that crowd obviously waiting with anticipation and bated breath to know where this case will go. Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, videotaped in that infamous tape that showed his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9.5 minutes. The prosecution's case is that he died as a result of that pressure, essentially suffocated, asphyxiated by Derek Chauvin. Let's go to NBC's Gabe Gutierrez. He's outside the courthouse watching the crowds, and that's building a sense of certainly tension out there. Gabe?
Yeah, Lester, this crowd has been growing over the last hour or so, and as you can see behind me, they're gathered here, holding up signs, chanting, throwing their support behind George Floyd's family, and watching right in front here of the Hennepin County Government Center. This is the courthouse where the verdict is expected to be read. I'm actually joined, Lester, by Philippe Cunningham. He is a council member in Minneapolis, and I've spoken with you, Philippe, many times since the death of George Floyd. And if you can put this into context for us, for our viewers, how significant is this moment right now?
I mean, this moment is hugely significant, not only here in Minneapolis, but also across the
Gabe,
country.
I hate to interrupt. My apologies to the councilman. The court is back in session. You're looking at Derek Chauvin. They're standing as the jury now is led into the courthouse. Of course, we have not, and we will not see the jury, but all the participants and spectators are standing right now as they take their seats.
Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes. Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. Be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All
right. Thank you.
Derek Chauvin, convicted on all 3 counts, guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in the death of George Floyd, and leaving the courtroom in handcuffs.
We're adjourned.
Chauvin remanded in the custody of the sheriff in anticipation of his sentencing. Now, 8 weeks from now, we want to go right to NBC's Gabe Gutierrez outside the courthouse. Gabe, describe the reaction.
Lester, it's just an incredible reaction here. A few moments ago, this entire crowd erupted in cheers. They started chanting all 3 counts. And the reaction can best be summarized by Bree Graham. She's the woman I spoke with just before this verdict was read, who told us that she had been traumatized watching this trial. Bree, what is your reaction? And when that verdict was read, what went through your head?
honestly, I don't really have the words for it right now, and I'm trying to take everything in. And it feels like we can take the day to celebrate that we're finally getting a taste of justice. And then tomorrow we move on to Dante, and we keep doing this until they give us what we need across the board, you know?
Bree, a few moments ago, I saw you you started crying. It was emotional for not just you, but many folks here. Explain to me a little bit more about, what did you have doubts leading into this verdict? How much anticipation, how worried were you about this?
Of course I had doubts. We have doubts every time something happens. I mean, we have doubts when the police say that he's unarmed and, Adam Toledo had his hands up. We have doubts when they lie about what the cameras are. We always have doubts, and this was definitive, and this was solidified, and we finally got the justice that we needed. People see it on the news and they don't understand, but living here and breathing this energy in every single day, it's so much, and it finally feels like the smoke has cleared just a tiny bit, enough just to take a deep breath,
Bree, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. You were telling me you're 31 years old. You've lived in Minneapolis for how long? 10 years?
Yeah, over 10 years in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and this is what I would call home. My friends are here. Some of my most important families here.
Incredibly significant moment. I'm glad we were able to share this with you, Bree. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah.
And again, we appreciate your time. Lester, what she told me is something we saw unfold here just within the last few minutes. If we can look around, this is the demonstrators that had gathered here. They all gathered close together to watch the verdict unfold live on their cell phones. And they all gathered in small groups, and some of the feeds came in just a few seconds before the others. Different people were yelling guilty on that first count. And then I think once the second and the third count came in guilty, there was just a wave that just rippled across this crowd. And I think if I could sum it up in one word, Lester, it is relief. Relief from a crowd that had been waiting for this verdict for months. Relief from a community that had seen razor wire and barricades and boarded up buildings just engulf downtown Minneapolis. Relief from people like Bree Graham, who did not know what would happen and who told us how this is something she'd been waiting for. And now the question becomes, is this just about George Floyd? What about Dante Wright? What about other police encounters that are still very much on the minds of the demonstrators here? But again, Lester, if I had to sum up what I just saw in the last few moments, it would be relief. Back to you.
Gabe, thank you for just joining us. Guilty on all counts against Derek Chauvin, who watched the jury or looked out toward the judge, his eyes darting, but a very serious, focused look as he heard those counts, all three verdicts read against him. And as we noted, he is now in the custody of the county sheriff there and will remain in custody pending his sentencing 8 weeks from now. Let's turn to criminal defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, obviously a huge effort on the part of the prosecution in this case. More than 40 witnesses, and they were victorious today.
They were, and I'm sure that if you talk to any of the prosecutors moments before the verdict was read, none of them felt it was a sure thing. None of them felt they had a layup. None of them thought it was a slam dunk, and they shouldn't. I mean, because they always have the burden, the highest burden in our law, beyond a reasonable doubt. They know that it only takes one juror, and it only really takes reasonable doubt about a single element of a crime. So for that reason, that's why you saw so many witnesses paraded through. But the prosecution was very methodical. They had witnesses that went to the emotion of the jurors, witnesses that spoke to the science, that spoke to the use of force. And as we can see, that presentation was very effective, and possibly even that final rebuttal by the prosecution, which was a little more passionate and ended with that memorable line about Derek Chauvin's heart being too small. Not that George Floyd's heart was too large, Derek Chauvin's heart too small. Might have left the a real mark on the jury as they went into deliberations. They might have been thinking about that throughout their relatively short deliberations. But as I said, in the grand scheme of deliberations, this was relatively long. But of course, in a high-profile trial, all the rules go out the window.
All right, Danny, thank you. I think we're looking at a shot from outside the food mart where that fatal, awful encounter occurred. Here we are. That's on the streets where there's been an ongoing memorial to George Floyd since all this happened last year, and where people now are gathering to mark this moment. Many people here had stood and called for justice, and justice certainly played out in a courtroom a few moments ago with the verdict in this case, the sentencing to follow. NBC News contributor Eddie Glaude and NBC News political analyst Eugene Robinson join me now. Gentlemen, reflect on what changes or maybe what doesn't change in the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of this.
Well, I can...
Go ahead, Gene.
I should have picked one of you. I apologize.
I can start. I just exhaled for the first time in more than an hour since we learned we were going to have a verdict. And one of my first thoughts was, it shouldn't have been this hard, right? He knelt on the man's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, choking the life out of him, and it was all caught on video from multiple angles. And we should have, I think, had been able to have confidence that. That sort of thing was not allowed. It's not acceptable, not an acceptable kind of policing in this country. And it says something about this country and where we've been, and hopefully where we're going. That in fact, I was very unsure as to what this quick verdict meant, and whether it meant they had completely disregarded the prosecution case or completely disregarded the defense case, and what it meant. I think this will be seen as gratifying by a lot of people, and as more of a beginning or a signpost than an end. We haven't reached our destination on the racial reckoning that we need to have in this country, but I think this will be seen as a step forward, and as opposed to what it potentially could have been seen as, which would have been a giant step back.
Eddie?
Well, wow. So, look, the first thing I want to say is that the jurors recognize that George Floyd's life mattered. And that's important, because for so long in this country, African Americans, black folk, poor folk, brown folk have had to live under the conditions of generalized disregard. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we must understand that justice is a practice, not an end. Justice is a practice, not an end. So we get justice in this case, but we know that we have to do something fundamental to change the nature of policing in this country. So now the hard work begins. We have this moment, yes, and I'm relieved, thank God, that the jurors of his peers decided that Derek Chauvin committed a wrong, that he committed murder on 3 counts. But we have the hard work to continue to build. As Eugene said, this is just the beginning. We're in an interregnum. The country is still trying to imagine who we will be moving forward, Lester. Let me tell you this, my stomach isn't in knots anymore.
Eddie, I look at this crowd, and I look at the crowd we showed outside the food mart, and there's no celebration. What I'm seeing, and maybe I'm reading it, is just relief, a sense of validation. But certainly no joy, and how can there be joy in the loss of a life and all that's transpired? But it's just something I note as I look out across these crowds.
Yeah, it's relief, it's exhaustion, it's grief, it's worry, it's concern. Right? We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and we still have Dante Wright. We still have the officers who will be tried, along with the other officers who participated in the death of George Floyd. So this is a moment of relief, but again, we have a long way to go. We are in that moment of transition, so we can at least breathe, at least for a moment, before we take the next step.
Gentlemen, thank you, Eddie and Eugene. Let me go to Kristen Welker at the White House. And as we've been noting throughout our coverage today, the White House watching all this very carefully. Any still plans, Kristen Welker, for the president to make some remarks?
It's my understanding, Lester, that preparations are underway for President Biden to make remarks. We're expecting those remarks to take place sometime this evening. What specifically will he say? That remains to be seen. But one White House official says he will call for peaceful protests. A White House official just giving me a sense of some of the reaction that is taking place here behind the scenes. This official says the view is that essentially these were the facts. When I asked if justice had been served, this official said yes. Now, again, we will have to wait to hear from President Biden to see what the official response is from the White House. But I want to go back to the point that you were just talking about. What happens next? President Biden is approaching his 100th day in office. He has made the issue of criminal justice reform one of his key promises, one of the things that he has said he wants to make progress on. We know that behind the scenes he has been pushing for the George Floyd bill to move through Congress. It's a piece of legislation, Lester, that has passed through the House. It's stalled right now in the Senate. There is a bipartisan push to get it passed, but it's not clear that there are enough votes to have that happen. What that legislation would do is that it would make it easier to prosecute police who are engaged in misconduct. So that's the legislative focus. But what, if any, more actions can the president take on his own? Are there executive actions that he will announce? For example, we know that this administration has been talking about a potential response to the verdict for weeks now, and we know that they have been weighing the possibility of a policy prescription. So I'll be listening very closely to see if President Biden addresses the policy piece of this or if he just addresses the verdict. We also know that the administration has been in contact with state and local officials, the governor in Minnesota, to make sure that if there are protests, that they are peaceful. We also anticipate the Attorney General will be quite engaged, not only with having communication with the White House, but with officials on the ground to try to make sure that the protests, that the marches that will undoubtedly take place will be peaceful. But again, this administration watching and now preparing for a presidential statement, Lester.
Kristen Welker, we'll stay close to you on that as we learn more information. We want to go back to Minneapolis now. NBC correspondent Megan Fitzgerald is there, and she is, again, keeping an eye on the crowd there that has been expressing its satisfaction and relief at the verdict just a short while ago, guilty on all counts against Derek Chauvin. Megan?
Lester, that's exactly it. You know, for so long, we have been talking about the tension and the anxiety that we can feel here in Minneapolis. Right now, there certainly is a sense of relief. Just behind me here and down below, we hear honking. We hear crowds gathering just outside of the Hennepin County Courthouse, yelling George Floyd, yelling justice. Like you said, it's not a celebration, it's a relief. I've been texting here with many protesters that we met last night who say it's like a weight that's been lifted off of their shoulder. They feel hopeful. If there is justice for George Floyd and with that we've all seen this video, they feel hopeful that there will be justice for other people of color that were killed at the hands of law enforcement. So again, the hope here, of course, is that things continue to remain hopeful. But in speaking with people all throughout the day here and yesterday who have come in from all over the country, this is the moment that they were hoping for, they said. It was important for them to be here to not only call for justice, but to also show support to George Floyd's family. And we had an opportunity to speak with them yesterday, Lester. This was the moment they said that they were praying for. It's relief, certainly, for the family who have been anxiously awaiting for this entire process to be over, because they were inside the courtroom. They were watching every single moment that as it unfolded inside the courtroom. So certainly relief is definitely the way to describe what's happening here in the Twin Cities. Lester?
All right, Megan, thank you. Let me bring in Melissa Murray, an NBC News legal contributor. Melissa, let me ask you about what happens now in terms of sentencing. That happens 8 weeks from now. You know, looking at the maximum on all these charges, 40 for second-degree murder, 25 for third-degree murder, 10 for second-degree, is it likely that the sentence would be concurrent, or how would you expect the process to play?
Well, the sentence will reflect the top charge there, that second-degree unintentional murder charge. So the statutory maximum would be 40 years. But Minnesota is a determinate sentencing system, which means that it has sentencing guidelines where the sentence is going to be a combination of the determination of Derek Chauvin's criminal history, which to my knowledge is non-existent, coupled with the severity of the crime itself. And that puts it at around 12 and a half years in prison. And then there are, of course, those Blakely factors that Judge Cahill reference at the end of the proceeding. So those aggravating factors will be determined by the judge himself with input from both sides, and he'll make that the determination, and that could possibly add some time to that guideline sentence of 12 and a half years.
All right, Melissa, thank you. Let me go to NBC News legal analyst Joyce Vance. She's a former U.S. attorney, professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Let me ask you about the prosecution's case. Anyone who doubted that the system could take a case like this, what do you say?
Guilty. This case really reinforces the value of the jury system in this country, but I'll confess that I had doubts. I've spent many years trying excessive force cases and civil rights cases, and we've seen cases where juries haven't done the right thing. So Eddie Glaude earlier on this program talked about the importance of this moment as a moment in time where we can transform and do better. The message today is that this jury held this police officer accountable for what he did, and they did it the right way. The important challenge we face going forward is making sure that the system imparts this kind of justice in all of these cases, and ultimately that we make sure that these sort of incidents no longer happen. So it's a moment where we saw the jury system work, and I've been involved in the system for long enough to hope that it can also be a transformational moment.
All right, Joyce, thank you. Let's go to Cedric Alexander, NBC News law enforcement analyst. And Cedric, as we've noted before, the prosecution said they weren't putting police on trial. They were putting Derek Chauvin on trial. Nonetheless, we watched, everyone from a police chief to other officers testify against one of their former fellow officers. Have things changed now in terms of policing and how these cases are viewed?
The answer I would probably say no, probably not at this point. I think what we're seeing today is a specific case under a specific set of circumstances in which you have guilty verdicts. But here we have to keep in mind, Lester, that this work is just beginning across this country in terms of what has and will need to be done. Because even though people may have a relief, it is going to be a temporary relief. I think it's important for all of us to keep our foot on the gas and continue to move forward around policing and even redefining what it is that we police to do, which I think is pretty cool. So this is just the beginning of a long process, and there has been, unfortunately, other George Floyds in the past in which people felt justice was not served. But however, we have a judicial system in this country, a judicial system, quite frankly, that works sometimes for some people. But what everyone in this country needs to feel is that there's a judicial system that works for everyone based on the evidence. This particular case, quite frankly, was clear-cut. Millions of people across this country, around the world, saw that murder take place in front of them. What is going to be more challenging for us as a nation and for policing and the criminal justice system at large is that for the cases that are still unresolved, the more recent cases that's going to be in front of us, how are we going to deal with them? Are we going to use the same level of competence in our judicial system and ask that people be unbiased in their decision and deal with the facts of case and not be partial towards anyone? We all understand that policing is a very tough job, and we support police in this country, and we need to continue to support them because people will be calling them tonight. But what is also important is that for all of us in this country to recognize that police and community must come together if we're going to resolve the issues of the past and make sure that we don't have future George Floyds and we don't have police officers that are sent off to prison because of behaviors that's unbecoming of any police officer in this country. We got a lot of good cops out there.
All right, Cedric, thank you. As we watch the crowds now continue to mill outside the courtroom, taking in what's just happened. Again, the 3 guilty verdicts, guilty on all counts against Derek Chauvin. Second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, immediately taken into custody while he awaits sentencing 8 weeks from now. The crowd largely constrained, subdued in many ways, and certainly showing a sense of relief and satisfaction that the system worked, in their opinion, in this case. All hoping, of course, that this will be a peaceful evening ahead as this verdict is absorbed, and this city that has been so emotionally wrenched over the last year begins to find its footing amid all this. And here's a picture outside the scene. I guess we can call it the crime scene now. This is where George Floyd took his last breaths, on this corner under the knee of now former officer Derek Chauvin. We saw many pictures of many angles of this intersection, both police body cams, a security camera across the street, even cameras from the convenience store across the street, where George Floyd had visited before his fatal encounter with police. There's a memorial at this site that has been ongoing since after his death, and you can see now people arriving at the scene to pay their respects and to remember all of what happened and what has just happened in all of this. Let me go to NBC correspondent Megan Pfister. Let me just, sorry, Megan, before we go to you, I understand we had pictures, we had some sound actually from George Floyd's brother reacting to this. Do we have that?
We're here in the family room, and we're going to have a press conference soon. But we just broke down in tears because, you know, all of the work and pain down through the years, all the families. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend is here, and we're going to talk later. But Rodney Floyd, his brother's here. Philonis is on his way from the courthouse. This is a monumental win, but it's only a round. The war's not over. We've got a funeral in 2 days. We've got Eric Garner that never got this. We got Breonna Taylor never got this. But God brought us through. And the first thing we're going to do with the press conference is have prayer and thank God. Rodney, just tell him how you felt. I know you were crying like I was crying.
Yes. I mean, I'm feeling tears of joy, so emotional that no family in history ever got this far. You know, we were able to get a guilty charge on all accounts. You know, we got a chance to go to trial, and they took it all away. So this right here is for everyone that been in this situation. Everybody. We are here. We stand in a unit. Thank you for Sharpton for being right here with us from the very first day until the last. I know we're not done yet. I love it.
God bless you.
That's Rodney Floyd along with Reverend Al Sharpton. His first reaction after that guilty verdict delivered by a Minneapolis jury today, as we again look at the scene, the crowd gathered at that scene where George Floyd took his final breaths. NBC correspondent Megan Fitzgerald is back in downtown Minneapolis for us, giving us a sense of the scene there. Megan?
Yeah, Lester, you know, just seeing those moments there of Rodney Floyd reacting to this verdict, like I was saying, I had a chance to speak with the family yesterday, and they said this is what they've been praying for. And when you really just break it down and think about it, they had to relive the moment that their brother, as they say, was just executed in the street. So this is incredibly traumatic for the family. And then I also talked to them a little bit about the trauma that was felt throughout the country, and they understood that. They understood that this case here was very personal, deeply personal for the entire country, and we see that with the protests that have broken out all across the country of people of all races and nationalities. And so just behind me here, down below, we can hear the honking, we can hear the chants of justice. George Floyd, the crowd has said on several occasions. There is a sense of relief here, and we've been reporting about the tension, about the buildings that have been boarded up, about the anxiety that was mounting in this town as they were awaiting for this verdict. So it's certainly a sigh of relief. It's a moment of hope. I've been texting with people that we met yesterday, many protesters who say a weight has been lifted off of their shoulders. They feel more optimistic that the country is heading in the right direction, that a black person killed at the hands of law enforcement has an opportunity to get justice. And so a lot of hopeful feelings here, Lester, with protesters that are on the ground.
Megan, thank you. As we continue to see the different shots of folks now waving flags and reacting to the verdict, I want to go right now to U.S. Senator from Minnesota, Democrat Amy Klobuchar, who joins us. Senator, thank you for taking the time to join us. Can you give us your reaction to this verdict?
You know, just seeing Rodney Floyd said it all. That family never gave up, and they know that this verdict will never bring back George. But what they know it is a first step to accountability. And I also wanted to acknowledge, you'll soon hear from him, Keith Ellison, our Attorney General, his team. They didn't make the story about them in bringing this case. They made it about George. They made it about the witness, the everyday people that just happened to be there, that carried this burden with them for a year, the police officers that were willing to testify and take on Derek Chauvin. This is their day, and this is the day for
What does this do for trust in the criminal justice system? You heard just a moment ago Reverend Al and others have talked about the cases that have not been solved. Breonna Taylor, no one was held in account for her death, and that list goes on and on. What should the takeaway be, at least from this case, in terms of the criminal justice system?
Lester, this is the call for action. This jury did the right thing here. But there's so many cases across the country, and to me, the Senate can't wait anymore. We have to pass police reform, the George Floyd bill. We have to pass police reform and ban chokeholds, and there are so many things that we could do, and Senator Booker is leading this effort in the Senate and doing an incredible job. And I hope my colleagues see this as a beginning and not an end. It's the beginning.
Senator, great to talk to you. We see the prosecution team here. Mr. Ellison, who you noted, is here as well. So let's listen in.
Thank you.
Yeah, more like that. Yeah, there's actually more room on this side.
There's more room on this side?
Yeah, more room to your right. Can we see everybody? Yes, thank you. That's much better. So Natasha, people got to be able to see the baby too. So.
Especially after the baby ran here, right?
Yeah. Baby on board.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Ellison. I'm the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. And since the investigation and prosecution of this case began last May, everyone involved has pursued one goal: justice. We pursued justice wherever it led. When I became the lead prosecutor for the case, I asked for time and patience to review the facts, gather evidence, and prosecute for the murder of George Floyd to the fullest extent the law allowed. I want to thank the community for giving us that time and allowing us to do our work. That long, hard, painstaking work has culminated today. I would not call today's verdict justice, however, because justice implies true restoration. But it is accountability, which is the first step towards justice. And now the cause of justice is in your hands. And when I say your hands, I mean the hands of the people of the United States. George Floyd mattered. He was loved by his family and his friends. His death shocked the conscience of our community, our country, the whole world. He was loved by his family and friends. But that isn't why he mattered. He mattered because he was a human being. And there is no way we can turn away from that reality. The people who stopped and raised their voices on May 25th, 2020, were a bouquet of humanity, a phrase I stole from my friend Jerry Blackwell. A bouquet of humanity, old, young, men and women, black and white, a man from the neighborhood just walking to get a drink, a child going to buy a snack with her cousin, an off-duty firefighter on her way to a community garden, brave young women, teenagers, who press record on their cell phones. Why did they stop? They didn't know George Floyd. They didn't know he had a beautiful family. They didn't know he had been a great athlete. And they didn't know he was a proud father or that he had people in his life who loved him. They stopped and raised their voices, and they even challenged authority because they saw his humanity. They stopped and they raised their voices because they knew that what they were seeing was wrong. They didn't need to be medical professionals or experts in the use of force. They knew it was wrong, and they were right. These community members, this bouquet of humanity, did it again in this trial. They performed simple yet profound acts of courage. They told the truth, and they told the whole world the truth about what they saw. They were vindicated by the chief of police, by Minneapolis' longest-serving police officer, and by many other police officers who stepped up and testified as to what they saw and to what they knew. What happened on that street was wrong. We owe it, and we owe our gratitude to we owe them our gratitude for fulfilling their civic duty and for their courage in telling the truth. To countless people in Minnesota and across the United States who joined them in peacefully demanding justice for George Floyd, we say, all of us, thank you. In the coming days, more may seek to express themselves again through petition and demonstration. I urge everyone to honor the legacy of George Floyd by doing so calmly, legally, and peacefully. I urge everyone to continue the journey to transformation and justice. It's in your hands now. I also want to address the Floyd family, if I may. Over the last year, the family of George Floyd had to relive again and again the worst day of their lives when they lost their brother, their father, their friend. I'm profoundly grateful to them for giving us the time we needed to prosecute this case. They have shown the world what grace and class and courage really look like. Although a verdict alone cannot end their pain, I hope it's another step on the long path toward healing for them. There's no replacing your beloved Perry, or Floyd, as his friends called him, but he is the one who sparked a worldwide movement, and that's important. We owe our thanks to the men and women of the jury who gave many hours of their time and attention to carefully listening to the evidence, weighing the facts, rendering a verdict. They are regular people from all walks of life, a lot like that bouquet of humanity on that corner on May 25th and in that courtroom. They answered the call, and they served in a landmark trial. They now deserve to return to their lives. If they ask you to respect their privacy, we ask you to honor that request. I want to acknowledge the remarkable team that helped us prosecute the case. We put everything we had into this prosecution. We presented the best case that we could, and the jury heard us, and we're grateful for that. We had the sole burden of proof in the case, and history shows that winning cases like these can be difficult. I'm proud of every hour, every minute, and every ounce of effort we put in this case, and let me tell you, we spent many hours working on this case, did we not? We, week after week, committee meeting after committee meeting, this team never let up, and it never quit. We fought every day, and we did it together. The Attorney General's office together with the Hennepin County Attorney's office. Thank you, sir. And we did it together. I'm deeply grateful to everyone who worked on the case. Most of these folks will tell you it's a bad idea to put together a team of all Michael Jordans. Nobody would want to pass the ball. This team, that was their true strength, is sharing the load, passing the ball, understanding that all of us together are smarter than any one of us alone. And that worked. Although the verdict has been rendered, this is not the end. In the coming weeks, the court will determine sentencing, and later this summer, we expect to present another case. We will not be talking about that. This verdict reminds us how hard it is to make enduring change. And I just want to finish by sharing some important historical legacy, if you allow me. In 1968, the Kerner Commission was formed to investigate the causes of uprisings across major American cities. And a man named Dr. Kenneth Clark, a famous African-American psychologist who, along with his equally accomplished psychologist wife, Mamie, contributed to compelling research in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And Dr. Clark testified at the Kerner Commission. And I want to quote you what he said. I read that report, the one in the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it was as if I were reading the report of investigating the committee of the Harlem riot in 1935, the report on investigating the Harlem riot in 1943, and the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must say again in candor to you, the members of this commission, it's like a kind of an Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendation, and the same inaction. Those are the words of Dr. Clark in 1968. Here we are in 2021. Here we are in 2021, still addressing the same problem. Since Dr. Clark testified, we have seen Rodney King, Abner Louima, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Laquan McDonald, Stephon Clark, Atiana Jefferson, Anton Black, Breonna Taylor, and now Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. This has to end. We need true justice. That's not one case. That is a social transformation that says that nobody's beneath the law and no one is above it. This verdict reminds us that we must make enduring systemic societal change. More than a month ago, months before George Floyd was murdered, the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington and I released the recommendations of our working group on reducing deadly force encounters with law enforcement. What all of us in that working group, including law enforcement, wanted is for everyone to go home safe. Anytime someone doesn't, everyone's lives are changed forever. We need to use this verdict as an inflection point. What if we just prevented the problem instead of having to try these cases? We don't want any more community members dying at the hands of law enforcement and their families' lives ruined. We don't want any more law enforcement members having to face criminal charges and their families' lives ruined. We don't want any more communities torn apart. One way to prevent this is to get into a new relationship where we as a society re-examine the use of force and our old settled assumptions. I'm so proud of Chief Arredondo and the Minneapolis police officers who by their testimony said enough is enough. And another way to prevent it is by acknowledging and lifting up everyone's humanity, helping communities heal, and officers be well. Another way to prevent it is with accountability. Passing laws and instituting policies and training is important, but they must be more than words on paper, and there must be accountability for violating them. With this verdict, we have brought some accountability. Finally, this verdict demands us to never give up the hope that we can make enduring change. Generations of people said slavery would never end. Generations said Jim Crow would never end. Generations said women would never be equal to men. Generations said if you were different in any way, you could never be a full and equal member of our society. Today, we have to end this travesty of recurring, enduring deaths at the hands of law enforcement. Those beliefs are things we have to focus our attention on. And as I now do close, I just want to say to you, the work of our generation is to put unaccountable law enforcement behind us. It's time to transform the relationship between community and the people who are sworn to protect them from one that is mistrustful, suspicious, and in some cases terrifying, into one that is empathetic, compassionate, and affirming. That will benefit everyone, including police officers who deserve to serve in a profession that is honored, in departments where they don't have to worry about colleagues who don't follow the rules. Now that work is in your hands. The work of our generation is to put an end to the vestiges of Jim Crow and the centuries of trauma, and finally put an end to racism. We can end it. It doesn't have to be with us into the future if we decide now to have true liberty and justice for all. The work of our generation is to say goodbye to old practices that don't serve us anymore and to put them all behind us. One conviction, even one like this one can create a powerful new opening to shed old practices and reset relationships. So with that, I just want to say that I do hope that people step forward and understand that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. You can do something the way like everyday people like Donald Williams and Genevieve Hanson and Christopher Martin and Charles McMillan and all those teenagers and young people stepped up and did something. You can do things like help pass the George Floyd Justice and Accountability Act. It's in your hands. Let's get the work done. And now I'd like to invite my friend and partner in justice, Michael Freeman, Hennepin County Attorney.
We've been listening to Keith Ellison. He's the Minnesota Attorney General, along with standing there along with the prosecution team, reflecting on today's guilty verdict on all 3 counts against former officer Derek Chauvin. As we look at these live pictures of the area near the courthouse, people who are reacting to and expressing relief, and appears some celebration now in the verdict that occurred there today. Let me go to Gabe Gutierrez right now, who's in the crowd. Gabe, are we hearing any more of the color from inside the courthouse, things that we couldn't see during the delivery of the verdict?
Well, Lester, before I get to that, let me, you talked about some celebration. Celebration certainly an understatement. Give me a sense for what we're house right now. You can see this crowd is really come here into the street. There are people honking their horns, cars honking their horns. Every few moments, people erupt in cheers. They, are talking about how, people literally dancing in the streets behind me. And this is, as I said earlier, Lester, this is justice. As I said earlier, Lester, there's a huge sense of relief here, Lester. There was a lot of anxiety building up to this moment, but as you can clearly see, people have been coming here, and really people that hadn't even been demonstrating before wanted to come out once they heard the verdict. And ma'am, were you here when the verdict was read?
Yes, I was here when the verdict was read.
What went through your head?
I was just very nervous. All the emotions just came out at once, and the second they said guilty, take to the streets, because it was just a beautiful moment when we finally get to see somebody get at least an inch of justice. But we know this is just the beginning, and we're about to go out there to Brooklyn Center and fight for Dante Wright, because this isn't over. This is just one name. We have so many more names, so many more people that we got to get justice. And so we're all here to just make sure that we can actually get that justice.
Well, the last few moments, madam, I've been speaking with people who thought they never believed this moment would come. They thought during this, leading up to this, they were just concerned. They were worried about what this trial might lead to. Did you sense that? Did you think that the verdict would end up the way it did?
I honestly wasn't sure. I was hoping that it would be a guilty verdict, but I was 11 years old when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and he didn't get justice. I grew up seeing my people not get justice, and so I was scared it was just going to be the same story over and over. So for us to finally have our first victory, it's crazy. And I just want to make sure that I'm here to get more and more of these victories.
Ma'am, thank you so much. What's your name?
I'm Frances Wallace.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Lester, something we're hearing over and over again. A short time ago, one of George Floyd's family member, I believe it was Rodney Floyd, said that he was filled with tears of joy. We're hearing that the president also called the Floyd family a short time ago. You know, Lester, after covering these protests, there was such a sense of frustration and, you know, this outrage that had been building here. That is not the sentiment I'm getting right now. This is, if not an all-out celebration, again, what I said earlier, just a sense of relief.
Gabe Gutierrez there outside with the crowd in Minnesota. And
back to you, Lester.
Thank you. And Gabe mentioned that call from the president to the George Floyd's family. I believe we have some video of it, of the family all listening in on the speakerphone as the president spoke to them and reacted to the verdict.
Hello. Hello. Hey, how you doing?
How's Gianna doing?
Feeling better now. Nothing is going to make it all better, but at least God, now there's some justice.
Right.
And you know, I think a Gianna's coming. My daddy's going to change the world. He's going to start to change it now.
That's right.
Yes. Amen.
Start to change it now. So, you've been incredible. You're an incredible thing. I wish I were there just with my arms around you. I'm standing here with Cedric. We've been talking. We've been watching every second of this. And the vice president, all of us. And we're all so relieved. Not just one verdict, but all three. Truly on all three counts. And it's really important. I'm anxious to see you guys. I really am. And we're going to get a lot more done. We're going to get police. We're going to do a lot. We're going to stay at it till we get it done.
Hopefully this is the momentum for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to get passed and have you sign.
We got to have that and a lot more. Not just that, but a lot more.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, this could be our first shot at dealing with genuine systemic racism. Look, there's two people here that feel strongly as I do. The vice president, she wants to say something.
Okay.
I'm just so thankful to the entire family. Your courage, your commitment, your strength has been a strength for so many people today. And this is a day of justice in America. And your family and history is going to show real leaders at this moment where we needed you. And in George's name and memory, we are going to make sure his legacy is intact and that history will look back at this moment and know that it was an inflection moment. You had to sacrifice so much, your family did too. But we really do believe that with your leadership and the president that we have in the White House, that we're going to make something good come out of this tragedy, okay?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, Madam Vice President.
And you better all get ready because when we do it, we're going to put you on Air Force One and get you here.
We're going to hold you to that, President Biden. Jesus.
I guarantee it.
Thank you, Mr. President.
What I'm most concerned about is Gianna.
She's okay. I'm going to go tell her in a few.
I'm here. My wife Jill's with me too.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
We're thinking about you. Watching every minute of it. So, had a good ending, but it had a positive ending. Things were very good.
Nothing is worth it, but like I said, I keep thinking of her words. Daddy's going to change the world.
Yeah, change the world. Thank God.
Well, you got a shot to make change.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, big change.
You tell her what I said. Remind her. She's president. She
Tell them we're going to personally get up there to see her.
I will.
Let them know we're going to personally get up there to see her.
Yeah. She's coming to see you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, Mr. President. God bless you.
Rather lengthy conversation there between President Biden, also Vice President Harris speaking to the family, reacting with satisfaction at today's guilty verdicts against Derek Chauvin. Let's go to Kristen Welker right now at the White House. And Kristen, this is likely not the last we are going to see or hear from the president this evening.
That's right, Lester. Preparations are underway for President Biden and Vice President Harris to speak. I just got off of the phone with a White House official who tells me that the vice president will likely speak first, followed by the president. They are not expecting new policy prescriptions in these speeches. Instead, what you're going to hear from the president and from Vice President Harris is a renewed push for Congress to pass the George Floyd policing bill. This is a piece of legislation that, among other things, will make it easier to prosecute police who are engaged in misconduct. It will also pour resources into training and readiness. Now, as we await remarks from the current president, we are hearing from former President Barack Obama. Let me read you a little bit of what he had to say in a statement that was released just moments ago, Lester. In his statement, he says, quote, "Today, a jury in Minneapolis did the right thing. For almost a year, George Floyd's death under the knee of a police officer has reverberated around the world, inspiring murals and marches, sparking conversations in living rooms and new legislation. But a more basic question has always remained: would justice be done? In this case, at least we have our answer. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we know that true justice is about much more than a single verdict in a single trial. True justice requires that we come to terms with the fact that Black Americans are treated differently every day. It requires us to recognize that millions of our friends, family, and fellow citizens live in fear that their next encounter with law enforcement could be their last. And it requires us to do the sometimes thankless, often difficult, but always necessary work of making the America we know more like the America we believe in." So there you have former President Obama calling for more change in the wake of this verdict today, essentially casting this as a starting point. He ends his statement by saying, "Michelle and I send our prayers to the Floyd family in the hopes that they may find peace. And we stand shoulder to shoulder with all those who are committed to guaranteeing every American the full measure of justice that George and so many others have been denied." Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker. So we will stay tuned for more further word from the White House and when we might see the president. We want to show you, we're about an hour now past when the verdict was read. We want to take you back in the courtroom to that moment in case you missed it as the verdict was read against Officer Derek Chauvin.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m.
The camera trained on the former officer as that verdict was read, and moments after that, he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, remanded into custody. Keep in mind, he's been out on bond, but taken into custody. The sentencing now 8 weeks from now. Let's go to former Seattle Police Chief and NBC News law enforcement analyst Carmen Best. Carmen, we appreciate you being here. Describe this through the lens of a police officer watching someone like Chauvin now going to jail and likely prison after that horrifying video we all witnessed.
Well, you know, Lester, I think many officers, the officers just like everyone else around the world and in the country, is certainly relieved to see justice served. There's often this saying that no one hates bad cops worse than the good cops because they take the whole profession down, and what is such a challenging profession to be in. And certainly I think everyone is relieved in many ways and on many fronts to see justice served in this manner. Certainly as a police chief, chief, the concern is going to be safety, and if the verdict doesn't come out in a way that's favorable, there's going to be real problems in cities and how you thread the needle, so to speak, about keeping public safety, but also not being overzealous. I'm sure a lot of people around the world, a lot of chiefs are relieved that they don't have to take additional action, as well as seeing justice served. And maybe, just maybe, we're turning the corner into a renewed confidence and faith in the system that many of us, including myself, have spent dozens of years working for.
Carmen, thank you. We'll ask you to stand by as we take you to Minneapolis, and there is the family of George Floyd, along with their supporters. You see attorneys, Reverend Al Sharpton there as well, and now Reverend Sharpton about to speak.
Before we say anything, we're going to have a prayer. When we first came to Minneapolis and went to the site, when Ben Crump called, we remembered how Eric Garner said, "I can't breathe," 11 times. His mother came with us to the site. The family came in, and this family has stood together for the last 11 months, watching this video go over and over and over again. This family stood with pain, suffering, and not knowing what the future held, because so many families went and got nothing. They thanked God when they got the indictment, which would not have happened had not the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, took this case. And Keith Ellison fought and put together a team that made this possible. And this is the first time in the history of this state that a white police officer has been convicted, less known convicted, of a murder. This is the first time in a long array of fights that we've seen 3 counts, guilty at all 3. We don't find pleasure in this. We don't celebrate a man going to jail. We would have rather George be alive. Amen. But we celebrate that we, because young people, white and black, some castigated, many that are here tonight, marched and kept marching and kept going. Many of them looked down on, but they kept marching and wouldn't let this die. And this is an assurance to them that if we don't give up, that we can win some rounds. But the war and the fight is not over. Just 2 days from now, we're going to have to deal with the funeral of Dante Wright in this same county, the same area. We still have cases to fight, but this gives us the energy to fight on. And we are determined that we're going to fight until we make federal law the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act must be law. We want to thank all.
Thank you for joining us. This is WYFF News 4 at 6 o'clock tonight, and we begin with the breaking news. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin found